This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Washington Post columnist Philip Bump discusses his book, The Aftermath. He examines how baby boomers have impacted the U.S. economy and political system and how future generations will fare. He's interviewed by Millennial Action Project President Layla Zaidane. I'm Juan, and I'm part of the team that produces C-SPAN podcasts. As a listener, you can help us continue to produce our quality podcasts about history, books, and current events with a tax-deductible contribution to C-SPAN's nonprofit operations. Visit cspan.org/donate to learn more. Thanks for listening.
Philip, congratulations on the publication of your book. I am so excited to discuss it today with you. You and I are both really interested in the generational shift that is occurring in this country right now. At a time where so much of the focus seems to be on younger generations, what made you want to write something about boomers?
Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, I've long been interested in the way in which generations are talked about in the United States. It probably started back when I worked for the Atlantic Wire and was writing a piece. Every so often, every couple of years, there's one of these little brouhahas in the media about what defines generations, who's what generation, yada, yada, yada. And one of those had occurred, and I actually called the Census Bureau and talked to them. And they were like, look, the only generation we recognize is the baby boom because it has clear demographic markers that the other generations don't. So that sort of started me down this path of every time I'd start hearing about generations, I'd be like, well, generations aren't really real, so why do we use them and how do we use them? And what is it about generational identity that actually serves as a useful descriptor for what's happening in American politics and culture? And so then that became the genesis of the book.
Mm-hmm. And so before we get too deep, tell us about how does generational identity get formed? And as you did the research for this, how did you avoid overgeneralizing or stereotyping around what is often referred to as a monolith and I think very much so is not a monolith?
Yeah, I mean, look, quite frankly, what I would do is I would make broad generalizations and then say it was a generalization. I mean, it's hard not to do that, right? I mean, it's hard not to sort of say, look, here are some characteristics that this massive group of people has. Obviously, it doesn't apply to everyone, but, right, that's just sort of, there's not really any way to get around that unless you start detailing the lives of however many tens of millions of people. When we consider generations, as I said, the Census Bureau only looks at the baby boom as a defined generation because you can see this sharp spike in births that occurs in the immediate aftermath of World War II and then continues on for about the next 20 years. Otherwise, when we talk about generational identity, we're really just talking about age cohorts. We're talking about groups of people who were born in certain year periods, right? And that's useful. It's useful to us just sort of collectively to talk about culturally. We all know what it means when we contrast Gen X with Gen Z, for example, when we talk about the silent generation as opposed to millennials. We understand those distinctions because it's easier than saying, people born before World War II or, people born in the last 30 years, right? Those are just easier ways of talking about it. But then, of course, there are also useful aspects of generations. Pollsters find it useful. Marketers find it useful. It is more useful to say, hey, this group of people shares this particular thing. And we have seen over the course of time that being born in certain, within the span of a certain period does tend to lead to certain shared inclinations. That becomes useful for people who are doing analysis of what America's all about.
Mm. So what does it mean to be a boomer, and how is that different from what it means to be, for example, a millennial?
Sure. So, I mean, what it means is different than essentially how the generations are constituted, right? And so when we talk about how the generations are constituted, there's some really sharp and important distinctions between boomers and millennials, or more broadly, between people of boomer age and older and people of millennial age and younger, Gen X, of which I'm a member, sort of constantly being that forgotten middle child as I'm about to do here. But the baby boom itself, consider that the baby boom emerged at a time in the United States when immigration was really at a low. There had been a backlash to immigration from Europe in the early part of the 20th century. There were still laws on the books, even as the boom started, preventing immigration or tamping down on immigration broadly. And so at the time, when the baby boom started, immigration, the average immigrant was someone's grandparent, right? This was someone who had immigrated from Europe, 20, 30 years prior. It was a whole different scenario. And then after the boom, immigration was relaxed again. Immigration laws were relaxed. And so you started to get a lot more people from Asia, people from Mexico and Central America. And that really changed what America looked like, in a way that has become a really fundamental part of how we talk about American politics, which I'm sure we're going to get to. But it means that the baby boom really is much more white than younger generations, that younger generations literally look different than did the baby boom. At the same time, younger generations continued the pattern that we saw really start with the baby boomers of being more likely to go to college and less likely otherwise to participate in institutions, being less beholden to political parties. The boom had a lot of aspects of that relative to their elders, but we've really seen that continue with younger generations. And so now we have younger generations much more highly educated than was the boom. They're much less likely to participate in institutions, much less religious, much less likely to be members of political parties, and all of those things are differentiators both culturally and politically from people who were members of the baby boom.
Mm. And so how did members of the baby boom generation potentially create this reality that my generation has been born into, right? Their impact on the workforce, on the economy, on culture itself. Sort of what do we have boomers to thank for?
Yeah, I mean, literally everything. I mean, modern America was built by the baby boom, right? And, the way to think about it is, first, I mean, we're bad at understanding the scale of the baby boom, in part because all of us live in an America that was created by the baby boom. There are very few Americans who are still alive today who preceded or can even remember what life was like before the boom emerged. But consider that in 1945, there were about 140 million people in America total. Over the course of the next 20 years, about 74 million more people were born, right? So more than 50% of the total population in 1945 was born in the 20 years following that year, right? That's a massive shift. And so what you started to see is as the baby boom got older, you started to see a lot of things start to break. You started to see, for example, hey, look, all of a sudden the diaper industry is this boom industry, right? Mm. Bronzing shoes became this massive business interest that made tons of money. And then very quickly that ended. After the boom, then those weren't lucrative businesses anymore. And we saw that same pattern. The analogy that's often used is a snake swallowing a pig, right? That you start here and then the snake gets fat and then it gets thin again as the pig passes through. It's an extremely gross analogy, but I think it's an apt one. And so we see that happening as the boom is moving through American culture and society. We see you have to build a bunch of schools because the baby boomers are arriving. You have to start figuring out what you're going to do once they graduate from high school. Where are the jobs for them? Maybe they should all start going to college. That's one of the spurs for why people start going to college. You have the Vietnam War, right? You have a lot of people being drafted into the military to go serve in Vietnam. There are all these aspects that are related to the scale of the boom. And then you also have, I know this is a long question or a long answer, but here we have it. You also have the fact that the baby boom is helping to drive economics broadly, right? So they get to their teenage years. They've got a lot of disposable income. You have the emergence of television right at that moment. You have the emergence of things like, the transistor radios and cars. These things all combine to create this massive cultural and economic force that's focused on the baby boomers. And my thesis is, in part, that over time, the baby boomers got used to being that center of attention. And so now, as that power is starting to go to younger generations, the baby boom is in the unusual position of being the ones out of power or with decreased attention paid to them. And I think that, too, is undergirding some of the tension we're seeing.
Mm. Well, I have to say, I appreciate you calling the baby boomers the me generation, because as a millennial, I have been on the other end of receiving the me generation moniker. So I appreciate you pointing that at others. And this metaphor, right, of the snake that swallowed a pig is kind of gross, but very apt. And I will say you were very talented at dealing with metaphors in your book, because you deal with something unpleasant but true, which is that as generations are born, so too must they perish. And,
right.
I don't think I've ever met somebody who can talk about death with so many metaphors and different ways of sort of talking about it.
Smoothing it out, sure.
Yeah. And
right.
so tell us about, in many ways, sort of this cultural, economic power that boomers had, that there's maybe one final act of power left in the boomers' briefcase.
Yeah, right. So, the people who are most fine with talking about baby boomers dying is either baby boomers or people who do research on death, right? So I talk to them, they're like, oh yeah, they're going to die, blah, blah. It's a little shocking because it's, outside our cultural norm in terms of how we talk about it. But yes, baby boomers are getting older, right? Right now they're in their mid-50s to mid-70s. They're aging. Baby boomers are increasingly, they make up most of the retiree population at this point. They are increasingly making up more of the number of people, of Americans who are dying each year. But that said, most, there's still a large chunk of baby boomers who are in their mid-50s, right? The baby boom is going to be around for decades to come. And so there are a lot of questions about what happens. So yeah, if we think about it with the pig going through the snake or going through the python to be more alliterative, eventually you get to the end of the snake, right? But you're still seeing that swelling at the end of the snake. And so I spoke, for example, with a woman who's involved in the senior housing industry, and they're just like stoked. They've been waiting since the mid-1940s for it to be their turn to reach their end of the python. They're finally here. Although it's interesting to note, senior housing is really aimed at people even still older than the boomers. So they haven't even gotten to that. The pig's just starting to approach them. But there are all these factors, all these end-of-life decisions, all these factors that come into play when you're talking about elderly people that are now starting to apply to the baby boom. So, for example, medical costs, right? Care of elderly people. The fact that America is going to be much older in the immediate future than it has been in the past also means that there aren't going to be as many people paying into government programs that are needed to help take care of the elderly, right? So there's going to be this new additional strain by this massive generation finally reaching the age at which they start to retire and start looking towards end of life. And it's really not even clear how America is going to be able to adapt to that, given the patterns that we've seen.
Mm. And so, I think that's such an interesting point, and one that was very salient as we think about the concerns that everyday Americans have today is the economy, jobs, and their financial futures. And knowing that we are in store for potentially quite a large disruption in the workforce over the next couple decades, where do you see some of the opportunities for our country or for folks who are in charge of making these big decisions to really prepare ourselves for this oncoming reality?
Yeah, we're already starting to see baby boomers become a declining portion of the workforce, right? They're retiring. This is what happens. This is very much foreseeable. But I think to some extent, obviously there are a lot of the economic picture of the course of the past 2 years in the wake of the pandemic has been extremely complicated. That's certainly true. But absolutely one aspect of the search for trying to find people to fill jobs is that you have more people retiring. So the people with whom I spoke, one of the things they pointed at was we need to figure out how we're going to bring more people into the country, right? We just simply need to either we need to substantially contract the economy or we need to bring more people in to do those jobs. The birth rate's not doing it. The American birth rate has been fairly stagnant and declining over the course of the past several decades. I shouldn't say that long. I'm sort of doing it off the cuff, but it's been declining over the short term. And so when you speak with sociologists, when you speak with demographers, one thing they say is we need to figure out immigration. We need to have a way, if we're going to have a society that looks like what it looks like now, that has people who are filling particularly these service sector jobs that are going to be increasingly left open, we need to figure that out. And one of the things they point out is immigration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you mentioned in the book, I'm going to read a quote here, the political choices that the boomer voters make will be more consequential for the direction of the country than their own financial investment and consumption behavior. And so for all of their participation in our economy and the workforce, you see their politics as actually one of the more significant contributing factors to American society. Why is that? Why do you see that?
Well, there are two reasons, really. The first is that when we talk about how the baby boom has approached power as it's gotten older, is there have been a lot of examples of baby boomers sort of building up barriers around their own power. And when I say power, I'm using power in a very broad sense. I'm not just talking about, holding the gavel in the House of Representatives. I'm talking about, home ownership. I'm talking about things like investments, right? There are all these ways in which power is manifested in this massive group of people. It's really important, of course, to have the caveat that I'm not saying that all baby boomers are rich. Baby boomers have a lot of aggregated wealth, but that's because there are so many boomers. On a per-person basis, the boomers are no wealthier than any other generation. But because they're such a massive generation, they hold much more wealth, and they have held much more political power, and they've managed to make changes to preserve power in a way that reflects the fact that they just simply have so many more people who are interested in doing so. So you have that issue. You have the issue of baby boomers who are trying to preserve power. But more broadly, you also simply have this increasing challenge between the boomers and younger generations over what power looks like. If baby boomers choose at this point in time, while they still have power, to either side with millennials, side with younger generations, or unilaterally in places where they have the ability to do so, to do things that change what American politics looks like, what American economics looks like, to increase, for example, the supply of housing. There are all these choices that can be made while they have power that then reshape what the future, both immediate and longer term, look like. should they choose to do so. And that's the point of what I was saying there.
Yeah. So, and we recently saw House Democratic leadership actually decline in age by a collective 93 years, with former Speaker Pelosi passing the gavel passing the title on to Rep. Hakeem Jeffries and the other three. And so that kind of jump, right? 93 years, almost a century younger in leadership. What does that do for the potential future of Congress, the potential future of policymaking?
Yeah, no, that was a really fascinating. And what was additionally fascinating about that moment was that the conversation prior to that happening was really focused on generational change, right? There was a lot of conversation within the Democratic Party, even when Joe Biden was running for president in 2020. We need to have generational change and better reflect younger America. And in part, that's because Democrats are more likely to be young than are Republicans, right? And this is a whole different aspect of the overlap of younger America and Democrats, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But yes, we saw this broad conversation about the need for generational change. And one of the other things that you see, too, is that when you track the age of Congress over time, basically from when the baby boomers got to the age when they could first start serving in the House, you saw the average age of Congress sort of rise with the boom. And just now, for the first time, you start to see it start to dip back down. You're starting to see boomers lose hold of that power, which again, of course, is part of the genesis of the book itself. So yeah, that was a really fascinating change, and I think it really reflects that the Democratic Party recognizes that it is dependent upon younger Americans, younger being a relative term here, 50 and under, for example, for their future success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that stat, and my organization, Millennial Action Project, actually recently tracked an increase in the number of young people running for Congress, an increase of 57% this year. We've got 91 millennials and 1 Gen Zer being sworn in, having just been sworn into Congress. And so we are starting to see sort of an uptick in the number of young people. One of the arguments that you make in the book is how the shifting demographics of our country have actually contributed to this current moment that we're in of toxic political polarization, sort of the role that boomers and now the rising impact of millennials and Gen Z have on sort of that reality of the polarization that we're living in. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about America and contrasting generations like the baby boom with younger generations, we're really talking about two different demographic groups of people, right? To the point that I made at the outset, the baby boom was much more homogeneous. I'm stumbling over the word. Much more homogeneously white, much more thoroughly white than younger generations, in part because of immigration patterns and in part just simply because of what America looked like at the point in time. And that's changed over time. And so you have this younger group of voters that's much more black and black and Asian and Hispanic in particular than was the older generation. And so it's very hard to extricate race and age to a large extent, because we know that black Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans all vote much more heavily Democratic than do white Americans, and that holds too at lower age levels. And so when we talk about what the future of American politics looks like, when we talk about some of this tension, when we talk about the reaction to Barack Obama being elected president, the reaction was theoretically, when we talk about something like the Tea Party, theoretically predicated on taxation. In reality, when you talk to researchers, the people with whom they spoke, the Tea Partiers were frustrated about where their tax dollars were going. It was going to things like paying for immigrants coming to the country or paying for welfare programs, right? And those, of course, are intertwined with issues of race. You also hear, when you speak with researchers who look at this, that one of the frustrations was that Barack Obama was so appealing to younger Americans, and that you had all these grandparents who were frustrated. Baby boomers were frustrated, like, how can my kids vote for this socialist, which is how he was viewed and portrayed on Fox News. And so you really saw 2008 as being a point at which the generational tension came into sharp relief. It really saw the first big gap in old and young in terms of how they voted. And that was absolutely intertwined with race, and it was absolutely intertwined with age in a way that's continued to this day.
And those kinds of phenomena tend to be much more visible, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle. Do you see, as you write about the political influence of boomers being very visible on the right, do you see the future of the GOP adapting to, what did you say, the fading of the boomer generation to replace that with younger voters?
Yeah, I mean, this was the idea after 2012, right? That the Republican Party came into the 2012 presidential race thinking, okay, we got this. Mitt Romney's going to edge out Barack Obama. Finally, we're going to get things back on track. And then, to their surprise, Mitt Romney lost. And so they engaged in this in the wake of that election. They engaged in this what came to be known as the autopsy, in which they got a bunch of senior officials within the Republican Party. They sat down, they did research, they looked at demographic trends, they looked at what was happening, and they put together a set of recommendations, included among which was we need to do a better job of reaching out to non-white Americans. The problem was, for the Republican Party, that by the time that report came out, in the aftermath of the 2012 election, you had two things happen in 2014 that reshaped the political narrative. The first was this surge in unaccompanied minors at the southern border, young people coming from Mexico and Central America, predominantly actually Central America, coming to the United States and causing a crisis for the Obama administration, but also a massive backlash on the right. And then you also had the emergence of Black Lives Matter, which really drew attention to the saliency of interactions between black people and police. And so both of those things helped trigger the rise of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump came out of the gates. The first thing he said, essentially, when he announced his candidacy in 2015 is he spoke out against immigrants and spoke out against immigration. And he really showed that while the autopsy of the GOP after 2012 had said, hey, we need to figure out a new path forward and reach out to people, Donald Trump showed, well, actually, we can still wring a lot of political power out of really quadrupling down on our appeal to, often xenophobic white America. And that's what Donald Trump did over the course of the next, what's it been now, 7 years. That said, yes, over the course of the long term, I think we've seen some softening of the Republican Party's positions on things like LGBTQ issues, with obvious, asterisks that apply there, and on things like climate change relative to where they were 15, 20 years ago. The GOP position is softer on those things than it used to be, even if it's not necessarily where it wants to be. And I think that is in part a reaction to the electorate broadly, driven by younger Americans, showing that their past positions were simply unacceptable.
Mm. In a lot of the ways in which it's difficult to talk about a generation without overgeneralizing, it can be hard to talk about politics at just the national level, right? Sure. And so as we think about, some of what you write in your book about the importance of state and local politics, what's happening sort of in our neighborhoods and our communities, where do you see some of the generational impact of boomers sort of paving the way for what the future looks like for civic engagement, our democracy, really starting at the local level?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard when we talk about that not to talk about something like housing, right? So I think everyone who's under a certain age recognizes that the housing process in the United States is a challenge, that it is hard to afford a house, that it is hard to find access to a house, that the perceived path, which isn't necessarily always accurate, the perceived path that existed 70 years ago in which you sort of had a good job and you worked at the job and you could afford a house and you could have a family, and that path forward, which wasn't always as smooth as we'd like to think it was, is very hard to accomplish today. And that's true. And that's in part because of, as we talked about, the baby boomers sort of saying, okay, well, we own houses, let's do what we can to protect our housing value, which is in part, it's worth noting, because a lot of boomers anticipate using their houses as retirement income, selling their houses when they get older. And so they're trying to protect the value of it now. But building these walls around home ownership. And so you look at the systems that are designed to actually make home ownership easier, right? And so what happens when you want to build a new house in most places in the country? You have to go through a review process. And there's some fascinating research that's cited in the book where they actually went and looked to see who was participating in those review processes. And the people who are participating are homeowners. And so they even looked to see, what happened when the pandemic hit. And, it wasn't as though you had to be a retiree sitting at home who had the time to go and do this. You could just call in from home and participate in the review process. It was still mostly homeowners. And so those people are driving where new houses get built, driving the objections to them. And that's an example of a place where home ownership, which is heavily, much more heavily happening among boomers than among younger generations, helps drive local politics, right? And so I think part of it, obviously, is, to your point earlier, simply engagement, getting engaged in local politics, understanding what happens with local politics. But I do think there needs to be some changes in the system. There need to be changes in the ways that we approach things, like zoning, which is obviously this massive national movement looking at it. But there do need to be changes along those lines for there to be something affected that will actually benefit people who are younger.
Right. And I think, you talk about zoning and most people's eyes maybe start to glaze over. It's not, the sexiest issue to get engaged around. But your point is that we need to prioritize issues that are reflective of those generations who are coming into power, who are becoming, the dominant generation in the country. And so perhaps sort of making sure that as young people experience these problems, there's folks in positions of political power who can actually prioritize and debate and engage on the topics that matter to a new generation.
Yeah, but this is a great point, which is that part of the reason the baby boom has so much power now and will continue to have so much power over the course of the next 10, 20 years is that they vote more heavily, right? It's not complicated, right? And everyone says this. You say it all the time, right? I'm sure you've had this conversation 1,000 times. If young people voted more, you would have more of a stake and more of a say in what's happening. Between that and the fact that over the course of time, it is more likely that white Americans will continue to be citizens as opposed to non-white Americans, the higher percentage of them. So when we talk about things like the demographic shift that a lot of white Americans are freaked out about, that Americans will become majority, minority, that's actually not going to happen in terms of representation and political power simply because of those differences in citizenship. And that, again, comes down to voting. More Americans vote. If you have that power to vote, the more you do so, the more power you get.
Mm-hmm. It's almost a chicken and an egg problem because faith in our institutions has declined. And of course, that faith is what inspires somebody to show up to, a political primary in the first place. And so where do you see some of the sort of realities that millennials and Gen Zers have grown up with, the partisan gridlock, for example, sort of factoring into how we decide to flex our generational power and what that looks like in terms of politics, but also in terms of, other ways of shaping what our society looks like?
It's a great question. There are a lot of people who spend a lot more time and who are much brighter than me who've tried to focus on how you get younger people engaged, right? Particularly given the fact that, as we've said, younger people tend to be less reliant on institutional participation. They're more likely to say, for example, that they're political independents than they are members of political parties, even if they end up voting more heavily Democratic. So how do you rebuild that faith in institutions? I think part of it is simply having honest conversations with folks. I'll admit, I don't know what that is. I think it's very difficult in this moment because we have this very polarized media economy. Not that the media is all powerful, but you have these two media universes that are talking against each other, one of which I like to think is more reality focused than the other. But it's just difficult. It's difficult when there's so much to be wrung from having an anti-institutional and often dishonest approach to American politics, an approach that is really based on division. There's a lot to be gained from that. As we saw with the rise of Donald Trump, who obviously was not known for his honesty or his efforts to build a big tent. And so I don't know what that looks like. And maybe what it looks like is we just slowly, over the course of time, we very slowly watch our politics change and people regain their confidence in it. But I don't think there's a short-term solution.
Mm. So you raised some pretty serious concerns. You're like the Paul Revere of the boomers are passing away. Pay attention. You raised some pretty serious concerns about what's to come. Are there sort of positives that you see or opportunities that you see over the coming decades that you want to highlight?
I think that we have a lot of opportunities in the moment to recognize where we are and what America is doing and what America looks like, right? I think one of the central themes of the book really is the overlap of age and race. And that is because I really believe that a lot of the tension that exists in the moment is foundationally rooted in concerns about immigration and race in particular. And so there's an entire chapter of the book, as you know, that looks at, for example, the extent to which projections that America will become majority-minority are accurate. And it's rooted in, the Census Bureau is a really great institution, and I rush to say that because I think they do great work. But they are bounded by the data they collect, and they've tried to make it so that they can collect a better and more complex set of data around race in the United States. They've at times been hampered by that, including during the Trump administration. But so, for example, the Census Bureau's projections, the last time they did so was in 2017, they project a certain percentage of America who will be Hispanic, up until 2060 or so. Those projections are based on assumptions about Hispanic American self-identification over time. And one of the things that other research has shown is that Hispanic Americans are less likely to identify as Hispanic in future generations as they've been in the United States longer. And so, things like that, we are there's a lot of discussion about when America becomes majority-minority that is rooted in assumptions about how people identify their own race that may not hold up. And, the other aspect of it is the Census Bureau made this really fascinating change between 2010 and 2020 about the amount of information they allowed people to submit to describe their own racial background. And so, for example, you could describe your background as, I'm white, but I also had relatives come from Africa, and I'm also part Portuguese. And, in the past, that would have been truncated to white or white and some African heritage, right? Now they allow you to provide a lot more information that they then have to hand code, essentially. And that led to this big surge between 2010 and 2020 in the percentage of people who said that they were white and some other race. And we hadn't seen that big jump before. And it was largely a function of how the Census Bureau recorded it. And so to some extent, you can look at the America as already being much less solidly white than we have perceived it as being, that this change has already happened to some extent. And I think that because it's so important how we talk about demographic change in terms of the response we get politically, I think it's important to recognize the nuances here. Mm-hmm. That was a very long answer, and I hope it actually made sense for viewers.
I think that's an important topic to sort of spend a few moments on, because the changing racial demographics of this country are so important to acknowledge. They are going to impact every facet of our society. And as somebody who runs an organization of millennials and Gen Zers, it's something that I think is a priority to our generation to really acknowledge in a way that, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, is full of the complexity and nuance that a topic as big as race, deserves. It's not that all people of one certain racial makeup are, all vote the same, all believe the same thing, all earn the same amount of money. And so I do think that sort of to your point of the diversifying nature of our country, creating these really helpful fracture points or diversification opportunities in how we think about what our society has been organized around, how we do things, what is sort of the status quo, having an introduction of new faces, new centers of power. I think that's a really important thing to discuss, and I just want to commend you for focusing so heavily on it in the book, because it's impossible to talk about the future without sort of underlining the impact that race is going to have on our country.
Yeah, I mean, and there's another aspect here too that your remarks made me think of, which I think is worth highlighting. So we talked a little bit about how the election of Barack Obama 2008, it really, it for a certain group of Americans really exacerbated a sense of concern they had about what was happening in the country. But yet something else happened that time, which you obviously, as someone who does a lot of work with millennials and younger generations, knows, is that social media emerged. And social media really gave individual Americans an opportunity to be heard and seen by other Americans in a way that didn't exist previously. I quote a PR rep in the book who talks about how you can be sitting in your bedroom in Cleveland and get 1 million followers overnight, right? And that can happen. And all of a sudden, not only is it the case that the baby boomers and other Americans who are concerned about these things, and not all baby boomers are, to your point, but all of a sudden, not only are they generally concerned about what's happening with the United States and the decline of white America, even if they're concerned about it not explicitly but implicitly, then all of a sudden you start seeing the really, really prominent voices of particularly non-white Americans that are being elevated, and young Americans who may be non-white and that would in the past not have been able to be seen, would not have actually had as prominent a platform in American culture, now just being able to do so and being very present. And you have things like OK Boomer, which is the millennials using social media to have a very direct, to hell with you guys thing, which, in generational battles are not new, but in the past, you couldn't simply make a viral song that blasted the older generation, right? So these are new aspects of it as well that I think are worth remarking on.
Another topic that you focus on, in addition to race, is education and how younger generations look a lot different in their educational makeup than boomers did. Tell us a little bit about your research there.
Yeah, so essentially the line has looked like this. When you start from the silent generation through the baby boom into Gen X and into millennials, the density of college education in those groups has steadily increased. So boomers were much better educated, not reflecting well on the subject at hand.
Classic Gen Xer.
Right. We're much better educated than their parents. Gen Xers were better educated than their parents. Millennials better educated than their parents, right? And so one of the things that we see this confounding of education with other issues like race and like living in cities and all these other aspects which also overlap with democratic politics. But it's very clear that better educated Americans, particularly more recently, have been more likely to vote Democratic. So it has this effect on politics. But it also appears to be the case that people who have gone to college, who've gone through that experience, have a broader sense of acceptance of culture, of different people, of different scenarios, right? Some of it certainly inculcated in the classroom, some of it, of course, just by virtue of the experience. And so we see that as really being something that can be determinant if you're trying to identify how people, people's worldviews or politics. College education can be very effective in that. So we see college-educated young people voting very much like college-educated older people, even members of the baby boom, because they have that thing in common. It's just that there are so many more college-educated millennials and Gen Zers as a proportion of those generations than it was the case with the boomers.
Mm. Yeah, and so that makes me think, we focused a lot on the differences between the generations. Are there any notable similarities that you pulled out or that are worth highlighting as we think about what the next few decades looks like?
Yeah, I think it's really important. To your first point, the first point that you raised here, that the boom is not one solid mass, right? That there are a lot of baby boomers who don't reflect any of the things that we've been talking about. If you look at the backlash to Donald Trump's presidency, the resistance movement, who was that led by? It was led by older women with college degrees, right? It was led by boomer women, because that's the boom itself is not something that is homogeneous, right? You have all these different elements to it, and so I think that you have a lot of baby boomers who've been exercising their political power in ways that actually reflect what millennials and Gen Zers want to see, that actually are voting along the lines of what younger generations would want, right? And so when we talk, for example, about what the future looks like is dependent to some extent upon the decisions we make now, boomers hold a lot of power. Boomers are helping to make those decisions, and they're not always doing it in a way that is solipsistic or selfish in a way that people can sort of assume. The boom is a very big generation, has a lot of different elements to it, and is, I think that there is a point of allegiance that can be raised there as well.
Yeah. And we do tend to talk about generational warfare and much less frequently about generational cooperation. Right. Do you see millennials as standing to inherit the economic boom that the boomers really were at the vanguard of creating? Is it going to skip over us?
Sure. Yeah. This is an important question, right? Is what happens with that wealth that's been accrued by the boomers? Again, on a per capita basis, boomers are not particularly wealthy relative to other generations, right? It is simply that there are so many of them, they have this wealth. But I spoke with experts, financial experts, who estimate that, we're talking trillions of dollars going to change hands. Already in 2022, they expected that about $2 trillion was transferred from boomers to either other generations or to institutions. And that's not all you die and then you have an inheritance. It is things like investing in college education or buying houses for young people, right? There are all these ways in which that manifests. And so it's not really clear. And part of the reason it's not clear is it's not clear how long baby boomers are going to live. The longer you live, the more likely you are to have to pay for things like, advanced medical care and senior housing, and that's going to draw down the amount of money you have. A lot of seniors are on fixed incomes from Social Security and things along those lines. And it's not clear if they live longer, how that affects both the Social Security system broadly and their own finances. So we're not really sure. We know that the money will be going somewhere. It necessarily must, but it may be going to healthcare facilities, right? I'm sure a large chunk of it will. I think that's an open question and one that I think is largely unresolved. There's another fascinating point that I uncovered as I was writing the book. A lot of older people have college debt. Some of it their own, but some of it on behalf of younger people as well. And so those are things also that are going to tap into the wealth that the baby boom has.
Yeah. And are these issues that you see being resolved by public policy? Is it something that we need to be asking politicians to really focus on now? Or is it, do you think, something that is just part of the natural process of age and time, and where the cards fall is where they fall? What is the best way to prepare ourselves for sort of this transfer, and what do folks need to be doing now to help smooth out that transition?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of this is simply just the nature of people getting older. But again, the baby boom is exceptional. We're having more people getting older now than we've seen at any point in the past, and that's going to change how these things work. And so one of the things that emerged as I was talking to experts for the book is that there has always been this tension between what sorts of investments we are making in ourselves, right? So, for example, let's say we have a fixed pool of dollars. Should we put more of those dollars towards senior housing, recognizing people are getting older, or should we continue to put it toward education of young people because we need to make sure that young people have good educations? What's the balance that's drawn there, and who's making the decisions about that? So this then gets into the who's voting more question, right? Mm-hmm. You know, if baby boomers are voting more and they're more worried about having financial support for senior housing, you're going to have a lot more investment in senior housing. You know, again, in keeping with the python swallowing the pig metaphor there, that you're going to start seeing more of a focus on that sort of spending potentially, unless we make different decisions. So yes, there is that element of tension, but because the boom is so big, once again, it's breaking that standard interaction, and we really do have to start making decisions about how we're applying public resources and which groups we're applying them to and how and when.
Mm-hmm. And one argument I would make is that having more young people in elected office can really help to bridge sort of where we're at to where we want to be in terms of just elevating the types of issues that matter to future generations, maybe operating from less of a short-term solution and more of a long-term solution, knowing that the decisions that I as a young policymaker might make are things that I'm going to live to see the consequences of. And so, you know, as we set up a generation of lawmakers to focus on some of the issues that you see as critical to backfilling potentially some of the holes that the baby boomers might leave when they fade. I'm going to need to look at your sort of lexicon of polite ways to say pass away.
As long as you try, I think you get credit for it.
But are there recommendations that you would have, sort of solutions that you think are really important to focus on now in order to set up long-term sort of preparations for our country and for sort of the rising generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple. The first is that I would say that we need to have a more nuanced understanding of race in America and the ways in which America has been shaped by immigration and shaped by race to this point, and that we are not necessarily heading down this path in which America suddenly doesn't look anything like it used to. We had the exact same debate a century ago when we started to see increased immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. I say exact same. I'm being a little melodramatic. Obviously, it was different in some substantial ways. But we had a debate over, is this somehow polluting the United States, right? We had that same argument, and we collectively resolved and said, no, it's not, right? So we've done that before. So I think that's a key aspect to it. I think a key aspect to it is media consumption and the extent to which we consume media that reflects the way in which we want to see politics, which I don't think is healthy or useful, really. I think we're all sort of subject to it, and that's just to some extent how the world works. But I think we need to figure out a better system for people getting information that's accurate and, free or doesn't cost a lot of money and is actually something that reflects a broader sense of American culture and society. And I think that we also just need to have more people of different backgrounds and different age groups and different race involved in politics and decision making. I mean, to the point you were just making, I spoke with the legislator Alex Lee out in California, he's in the state assembly, just won re-election there. And, at the time he first won, he was living in his parents' house because housing was so incredibly expensive in the Bay Area where he lives. You have Maxwell Frost, who came, and, the first Gen Z member of Congress, gets to Washington, all of a sudden he discovers he can't rent a place. His rental application is rejected. Right? Having them in positions of power is good because what it does is it forces those sorts of issues which affect a lot of people. It doesn't affect anyone in Congress, save Mr. Frost at this point in time. But it affects a lot of people, and having people there who are cognizant of that and have that lived experience, I think, is important.
Yeah. Yeah, another anecdote, a young person that I know who had to suspend their campaign because their roommate moved out of their apartment and they got priced out of the district that they were running to represent because they couldn't afford to live alone. And so, yes, to your point, sort of making a bunch of changes to a bunch of different places in order to sort of support this changing landscape of political power, I think is very important.
Or at least having someone in the room who's cognizant of it.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's not even necessarily the case that we need to overhaul everything, but just to have it on people's radar screens is important.
Yeah, and to be somewhat fluent in being able to share experiences. One point that you just mentioned is media consumption and how we have a conversation about what is happening. And it strikes me that, yes, millennials and Gen Zers really came of age in a time where the news and media landscape looks very, very different than how it looked when boomers came of age. And there was, a lot more centralization of information and credible ways of disseminating sort of truth. Especially as a journalist, I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of the current media landscape, how we change the conversation or how we have the conversation in order to, stabilize perhaps how we operate from sort of a shared set of facts and truth.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, and it's not one I have a pat answer to, because you're right. I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I work for the Washington Post. I write articles that reflect what I believe to be accurate information about the world. Of course, I've made mistakes. Everyone's made mistakes in the past. But our information, too, because it's a high-quality publication, we charge people to see what we read, right? Whereas you get Twitter accounts that spread misinformation or explicitly false information or present news through a lens that reflects a particular worldview that are free. And, you have blogs like Breitbart where you can go and read whatever Breitbart's take is on the world that you don't have to pay for. And so you consume that. I mean, there's this interplay of economics and accuracy that I think is challenging in the moment. And I think it's been fostered to a large extent by the rise of social media. Social media has been a huge boon for the news industry because we get a wide variety of voices that are able to share information and offer opinions on what's going on in the world. It's been really, really important, really, really good on net. But at the same time, it also allows people to cocoon in their own universes of how they want to see things. And you get things like QAnon that arise as a result of that. Obviously problematic. Satanic cult of pedophiles being something that people believe is not ideal. We should not encourage that. I don't know what the future looks like, though. I don't know what it looks like to increase America's interest in receiving information, because that's really what it's about. If you want to pay for the Washington Post, it's because you want a certain standard of quality in your news consumption. And if you don't care about that quality of news consumption, you're not going to pay for the Washington Post. You're just going to go and you're going to follow Jack Posobiec on Twitter or whatever it happens to be, right? I mean, there are all these other avenues for you to get information. If you don't feel like paying for it and you're not particularly worried about the accuracy and you want it to reflect a worldview that you have, then you can get that. And you can get it for free, and it's engaging, and it gets you mad, and it's fun. And, there are all these aspects to it that traditional news outlets are disadvantaged, like the Post. And I don't know what the solution to that is. And if you do, please, let's work on it.
Yeah, and I wonder how much, because younger folks have been at the receiving end of so much advertising, right? It's just been supercharged. How much potentially our own internal BS meters might have become more sophisticated than, folks who maybe grew up in the Walter Cronkite era of this is where truth comes from, and sort of an inherent higher level of trust in the information that they're receiving, whether or not millennials and Gen Zers, because we are swimming in just sort of spin and bias, if the next few decades look like us having maybe a more refined ability to discern truth from fiction.
And there is research that suggests that's what's happened, right? Yeah, I've seen research that actually suggests that there isn't a big generational difference, but I've seen research which I tend to think is accurate, which suggests that actually older Americans are worse at picking out false information from true information, in part because, you're right, they grew up in an environment where if it said, X news source or X post, that you would believe it because the news didn't go out of its way to mislead you. And so we saw, for example, in 2016, when you look at, there were a lot of efforts in 2016, particularly before Twitter and Facebook cracked down on the spread of misinformation. You saw a lot of people, particularly in Eastern Europe, that would stand up these websites that were just total nonsense, just completely contrived. And there was this great reporting done by BuzzFeed, and what they discovered was in Macedonia, these kids made these websites that were just misinformation. They said, the people who believe this are Trump supporters, and they tend to be older Americans. We tried it with with Democratic candidates, and it didn't bite. Like there just wasn't as much uptake. And I think that we see these patterns that are reflected in our lived experience, which match the research, which suggests that because younger people did come of age in this era when you have to be wary of the source of information you're getting, that they're better at discerning things that aren't true.
So we only have a few more minutes left, and I really want to get to perhaps some concrete stories or examples of where we see shifts or folks proactively engaging to guard against some of the shifts that we see on the horizon. Are there places or policies or ideas that you have seen start to take root that can really make sure that this transition of generational power between boomers to younger generations happens as smoothly and effectively as possible and really sets us up for a future in which folks are thriving?
Well, I think the central issue is the one that you indicated, or the one that we discussed earlier, which is just getting young people to participate more. I'm Gen X. I'm not going to say what the best policies are for millennials and Gen Z because I can't speak to that. Millennials and Gen Z can speak to what they think the best policies are for themselves. I think that what thing we need to pay attention to is the extent to which they are represented and participating in the process, having them run for office more, having them vote more. I think that's very important to have that representation, as we said, that voice in the room. I also think that it's incumbent upon baby boomers to be aware of the fact that they are an exceptional generation, that they have held power for so long that they may not even be aware of the extent to which they've held power. They may not be aware of the extent to which they are exceptional. And so the first part of the book really looks at that and really tries to elevate, look, this is a unique situation. You are a unique group of people, and you need to be cognizant of that because that uniqueness tends to make you sort of isolated, solipsistic as a collective, not individually necessarily, and make decisions based on that. And I think it's important to elevate that this is a very different group of people in American history, and I think, the entire thesis of the book is that's a big contributor why we are where we are right now in the country, because this group that has held power for so long may not even be cognizant of it, is now competing with a group of people that is, the same size as they are for the first time in American history.
Yeah. And, Philip, it strikes me, we do often skip over poor Gen X.
Yeah.
What is the role that Gen X has to play in this moment? Or do you see it as sort of matching in power the subsequent generation, millennials or Gen Z? Sort of, where does Gen X fit into all of this for all the Gen X viewers right now?
I mean, look, I'm glad I am Gen X because I can sort of be dismissive in a way that isn't too off-putting, I hope. But, essentially, America's population went big baby boom, a little bit of Gen X, millennials, right? And so there really was this dip. There just simply are fewer Gen Xers. That was the emergence of Gen X marked the end of the baby boom. There was a change and a downshift in the number of babies being born. There are just simply fewer of us. And so, what power do we hold? And also the Gen X, when we talk about how big generations are, because these are sort of arbitrary, I tend to use the Pew Research Center definitions of the generations. But Gen X also was fewer years, so that makes the generation even smaller. Look, what do we do? We're going to hold power for a little bit until the millennials surpass us. That's how it's going to go, both in politics and culturally. So, Gen X had its moment. We're starting to see, we saw the Super Bowl last year had, Dr. Dre and Eminem and all these Gen X hip-hop stars. And, we're all like, yeah, and we realized we were old because all of a sudden it was our turn to finally have our artists be at the Super Bowl. But that's, we're going to have our moment, and it's going to pass quickly, and so be it.
Yeah, it's pretty tough when you turn on an oldies station and you hear music that you actually grew up listening
Nirvana,
to.
Right, exactly. Sure.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
If you could fast forward, 30 years, 40 years into the future, I think the year that you cite is 2060. Yeah. What does America look like in that moment? And are there, sort of working backwards from that, just important milestones or moments that will be important as a country for us to sort of unite around in terms of making sort of a productive 2060?
Yeah, I mean, I'll caveat it by using the example I use in the book, which is that, in November 2019, you could not possibly have predicted what November 2020 would look like, right? And that was a span of 12 months. So, I'm looking forward, 30 plus years. So, so please, future historians, do not hold me to this. But, what the Census Bureau tells us is that demographically, at least, what America is going to look like is what Florida looks like now. It's going to have the same density of, much more heavily old, much higher population of Hispanics and Asian Americans and African Americans. That collectively the non-white population will be larger as a relative to the overall population than the United States is now. Does that mean then that America politically looks like Florida? I don't think so, because Florida's politics right now are driven by a number of different things, including that the older population in Florida is very heavily white and more conservative than I think the older population will be in 2060. That there are obviously unique characteristics to the Hispanic population in Florida that may not carry over broadly to the United States. But that's essentially what America is going to look like. It's going to look demographically like Florida. But I think it's hard. One of the experts with whom I spoke is a political consultant who does a lot of work in Florida. He pointed out that over the years there's been this anticipation. Okay, Florida is getting less centrally white. Does that mean that it starts to move to the left? Obviously, that's not what we've seen. But again, does that example hold? Does America continue to look like Florida politically, even if it looks like Florida demographically? I would suggest that it probably won't, because I think that in part the Republican Party really needs to try and do a better job of reaching out to younger Americans and changing its policies to be responsive to them. And simply in part because, it's a long time. And I would never want to say that I can speak definitively to what's going to happen in 35 years' time.
I think a lot of us are out of the predictions game.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So, Philip, thank you so much for your time. I recommend everyone read your book. It is informative. It is funny. It is terrific. Philip Bump, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.